from cloud seeding with biochemicals to underwater nuclear detonations that distorted the Pacific. These weren't just tests, they were rehearsals for an unthinkable future. And for decades, they stayed sealed under layers of clearance, disinformation, and denial. If you've made it this far, you're already deep inside the file. So stay with us as we uncover the final fragments of history's most obscure military experiments. Let's start the second part of Brutal Experiments. Number 31, Project High Jump. In the frozen silence of Antarctica, beneath skies that rarely speak and ice that never forgets, a massive military operation unfolded in 1946, one that continues to invite questions to this day. Officially designated as the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program, Project Head Jump mobilized 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft. Its stated mission: to establish a research base, test equipment in extreme cold, and extend American presence at the bottom of the world. But the scale and secrecy surrounding the expedition raised eyebrows of then. Led by Admiral Richard Byrd, the operation pushed deep into uncharted Antarctic territory. Some reports hinted at unusual encounters, mechanical failures without clear cause, aircraft lost under strange circumstances, and Byrd's own cryptic statements upon returning. In one post-expedition interview, he warned of enemy aircraft that can fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. The quote has since become fuel for decades of speculation. While declassified documents remain consistent with the research narrative, many researchers note inconsistencies in the timeline, unexplained equipment losses, and the sudden curtailing of the mission months ahead of schedule. In Antarctica, the cold preserves everything except the truth. Number 32, Operation Argus. High above the South Atlantic, in one of the most remote corners of the Earth's atmosphere, a series of nuclear detonations lit up the sky in absolute secrecy. The year was 1958. At the height of Cold War paranoia, the United States sought not only to weaponize space, but to understand how the upper atmosphere could become a battlefield. Operation Argus, conducted under the tight veil of national security, involved the detonation of 3 nuclear warheads at altitudes exceeding 300 miles. These weren't tests of brute force. They were experiments aimed at triggering artificial radiation belts, disrupting communications, and probing the very limits of atmospheric physics. Conducted by the U.S. Navy in just over a month, the operation pushed technology and logistics to the brink. Massive tracking arrays, observation ships, and high-altitude rockets coordinated in a synchronized choreography to capture data that would remain largely classified for decades. Scientists testing nuclear bombs. The tests did produce artificial radiation, belts, and subtle geomagnetic anomalies that lingered far longer than anticipated. But what else did Operation Argus reveal? To this day, some physicists argue we tampered with forces we only partially understood and may still not fully grasp. When you set off a nuclear device in the sky, you're not just lighting up the night, you're writing something into the Earth's invisible fields, something we may not be able to erase. Number 33, Operation Fishbowl above the Pacific Ocean in 1962. Something strange was happening. High above the clouds, in the void where the atmosphere thins into space, the United States was detonating nuclear weapons. This wasn't an act of war. It was a test. One of the most infamous tests, dubbed Starfish Prime, lit up the night sky with a blinding flash that was visible over 1,000 miles away in Hawaii. Electromagnetic pulse, EMP, generated by the explosion, knocked out streetlights and damaged electrical systems across the islands. In space, satellites failed. Radiation belts, artificial and unanticipated, lingered for months, damaging not only enemy assets, but American ones too. The tests revealed powerful truths, that a single nuclear blast in near space could cripple a continent's electronics. But they also raised unnerving questions. Had humanity, in its haste to understand the sky, altered something fundamental in it. The lights have long faded. The data has been filed away. But in the quiet zones above Earth, invisible scars may still remain, remnants of a time when we reached for power and left fingerprints in the ionosphere. Number 34. Operation Dominic. In the spring of 1962, a remote Pacific island became the launchpad for one of the most ambitious and least understood nuclear testing campaigns in U.S. history. Codenamed Operation Dominic. Hey, it was a massive response to renewed Soviet weapons tests, but what unfolded extended far beyond geopolitical signaling. Over a period of just 7 months, the United States conducted 31 atmospheric nuclear detonations, many of them above and around Johnston-Atollan isolated coral island, chosen for its distance from populated areas. With the Cold War heating up and the Berlin crisis looming, the goal was clear: demonstrate strength, gather data, and probe the unknown effects of nuclear explosions at high altitudes in varying conditions. These weren't just conventional blasts. Some tests were carried out hundreds of kilometers above Earth's surface, designed to interact with the planet's magnetic field. Others were launched by high-flying B-52 bombers or by missiles arcing into the upper atmosphere. Among them was Starfish Prime. Its blinding flash lit the night sky across the Pacific, knocking out electronics in Hawaii and creating artificial radiation belts that lingered in orbit. The scientific results were as staggering as the visuals. Instruments captured data on electromagnetic pulses, ionospheric reactions, and radiation distribution, but some of those effects remain only partially understood to this day. Operation Dominic ended as abruptly as it began. The tests ceased, the clouds dispersed, and the island fell silent once again. But in the silence, one question lingers. What exactly did we unlock in our race to understand destruction from above? And at what cost? Number 3. 5. Project Vela. In the quiet void of space, a silent watch began. Launched in the early 1960s, Project Vela was not a spacecraft, but a series of highly classified satellite SITS mission to watch the skies for light no human eye could see. Born from Cold War anxieties and nuclear treaties, Vela was designed to detect unauthorized nuclear detonations across the globe, even in space. These satellites orbited high above Earth, equipped with instruments capable of detecting the faintest gamma rays and neutron burst signatures of nuclear explosions. Over time, Vela grew into a sophisticated network, quietly recording flashes in the upper atmosphere, deep oceans, and beyond. Most of what it observed was expected till September 22, 1979. That morning, Vela 6911 recorded a brief double flash of signature, identical to a nuclear detonation somewhere in the remote waters between South Africa and Antarctica. The signal became known as the Vela incident. No country claimed responsibility. No explosion was ever confirmed. Pointed to weather anomalies. Others whispered of covert tests. Decades later, the event remains unresolved. A single flash, captured by a satellite, long forgotten by most, sparked one of the most enduring nuclear mysteries of the 20th century. Was it an unacknowledged test, a false alarm, or something else entirely, something that never made it into the official reports? The sky had blinked and then gone still. But the question remains, what did Vela really see? Number 36. Project Azorian. Beneath the surface of the Pacific, a secret mission unfolded, one so complex it defied belief, and so quiet few even knew it had happened. In 1974, the United States embarked on one of the most ambitious covert operations of the Cold War. The goal: to recover a sunken Soviet submarine K-129 that had mysteriously gone down northwest of Hawaii 5 years earlier. At the heart of the mission was the Hughes Glomar Explorer, a massive deep-sea mining vessel constructed under the cover story of harvesting manganese nodules from the ocean floor. But in truth, it was built for one purpose: to secretly lift a Soviet submarine from 3 miles beneath the surface. The logistics were staggering. The pressures at that depth were crushing, and the secrecy had to be total. The recovery system, codenamed Clementine, was a mechanical claw designed to grasp the submarine's hull in darkness and silence. But not everything went according to plan. Midway through the operation, the claw reportedly fractured, losing a large portion of the sub. What the U.S. did manage to retrieve remains classified. Some sources say cryptographic equipment and Soviet nuclear warheads were recovered. Others claim only bodies were brought up, later buried at sea with full honors. No government has ever fully confirmed what was found on the ocean floor. And as the waves closed back over the Pacific, the truth, whatever it was, sank back into silence. Number 37. Operation Ivy in the stillness of the Marshall Islands. An island called El Huge Lab vanished erased in less than a second. It was November 1st, 1952. The United States, deep into its race for nuclear supremacy, launched Operation Ivy, a top-secret series of nuclear tests, the first full-scale test of a hydrogen bomb. Unlike the atomic weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this device relied on nuclear fusion, the same process that powers the sun. The explosion produced a fireball more than 3 miles wide, vaporizing the island beneath it. A mushroom cloud soared over 130,000 feet into the sky, and the blast released the energy equivalent of 10.4 million tons of TNT, far surpassing anything the world had seen. Officially, the Ivy tests were a leap in defense capability, but the sheer scale and secrecy surrounding the operation have long stirred unease. The test site was remote, the technology unproven, and the effects on ecosystems, weather, and radiation still debated today. Some researchers believe the test altered ocean patterns in the surrounding region. Others point to its psychological impact, fueling an arms race that would define the next half-century. What began as a scientific achievement left behind a crater over a mile wide in an uneasy silence. Because while the detonation ended in seconds, its consequences may still be unfolding in ways we have yet to fully understand. Number 38. Operation Teapot in the Nevada desert. Just beyond the shimmer of heat and silence, the ground once trembled with the force of invisible wars. Operation Teapot, a series of 14 nuclear detonations conducted by the United States in 1955, was not only about weapons testing, it was a rehearsal for survival. It's the height of Cold War tensions. This operation explored more than raw destructive power, simulated life after the blast. Entire mock towns were built, complete with houses, furniture, mannequins, and stocked pantries. Then, they were vaporized. Cameras rolled as fireballs engulfed suburban streets, recording the fragility of civilization under nuclear conditions. Each detonation had a purpose: to study fallout patterns, strength of reinforced bunkers, and even the viability of military operations immediately after a nuclear strike. Troops were stationed mere miles from the blasts, ordered to march toward the mushroom clouds after detonation. The official narrative claimed safety protocols were followed. Yet, decades later, veterans would come forward with cancers, mysterious illnesses, and unanswered questions. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Operation Teapot wasn't what it destroyed, but what it revealed. Behind the calculated detonations and scientific instruments was a chilling calculus: how much loss could be managed, and what a nuclear future might realistically look like. And in those silent, scorched foundations left behind, some believe the future had already been written. Number 39. Operation Plowshare. Beneath the guise of peace, a different kind of explosion was quietly prepared. Launched in 1957, Plowshare was the United States' ambitious attempt to turn nuclear weapons into tools for progress. Plow's premise was as radical as it was controversial. If atomic bombs could level cities, could they also carve canals, mine resources, or dig harbors? It was nuclear energy, not for war but for construction. The program proposed using underground detonations to blast through mountains, reroute rivers, and unlock deep natural gas reserves. One of its most notable test project, Gasbug, detonated a nuclear device 4,000 feet beneath the New Mexico desert, hoping to fracture rock and release trapped gas. The explosion worked, but the gas it yielded was too radioactive to be used. Over the years, 27 nuclear detonations were conducted under Plowshare's banner. With each, hopes for peaceful atomic engineering dimmed. Radioactive fallout, contamination fears, and growing public unease began to outweigh the dream. The idea of nuclear-powered earth-moving soon faded into something darker, a reminder that some technologies, no matter how carefully repurposed, resist domestication. By the late 1970s, the program was quietly dismantled. Yet its traces remain in irradiated test sites and archived footage of Earth rippling like water, and in the lingering question, when the line between weapon and tool is this thin, what future were we really building toward? Number 40, Operation Delirium. For years, deep within military hospitals and research centers, psychological battlefield was unfolding, one that few outside ever knew existed. Operation Delirium was not a campaign of tanks or missiles, but of the human mind. Conducted from the 1950s through the 1970s under the auspices of U.S. Army chemical and medical research programs, this covert project tested powerful hallucinogenic and psychoactive substances on unwitting soldiers. Substances like LSD, BZ, 3-quinacladonyl benzylate, and other deliriants were administered in controlled environments designed to simulate battlefield conditions. The goal, to study how the mind might fracture under chemical assault and how to control or exploit that break. At the center of the operation was Dr. Van Murray Sim, military psychiatrist who believed that understanding extreme mental states was essential to preparing troops for chemical warfare. Hundreds of soldiers, many of them volunteers, unaware of the full scope, were subjected to experiments that induced hallucinations, paranoia, memory loss, and complete psychological disorientation. Some endured effects lasting days, others far longer. Officially, Operation Delirium was framed as necessary science defensive research in the atomic age. But decades later, questions remain. Consent was murky. Outcomes were often buried. And the long-term impact on those involved remains largely unexamined. What does it mean when a government studies madness? To cure it, but to understand how to create it. And what else might still lie buried in the classified margins of psychological warfare? Number 41, Operation Deception. In every great war, the battles you don't see are often the ones that decide the outcome. Operation Deception was never a single mission, but rather an entire philosophy of warfare. From World War II through the Cold War and beyond, militaries around the world developed vast, intricate campaigns built not on weapons, but on illusion. The goal was to make the enemy act on a lie. One of the most well-known branches was Operation Bodyguard, the deception strategy behind the Allied invasion of Normandy in 1944. Fake armies, inflatable tanks, false radio traffic, even a dead body planted with counterfeit documents, all orchestrated to mislead German intelligence. The result? Hitler diverted his forces to the wrong coast, while the real invasion stormed ashore in Normandy. But deception didn't stop there. During the Cold War, misinformation became its own weapon. The US and Soviet Union engaged in countless layers of strategic manipulation, fake missile silos, phantom radar stations, and entire ghost divisions that existed only on paper or through staged movements. Military deception required artists, engineers, and psychologists as much as it did generals. It blurred the lines between theater and battlefield, between what was real, and what was meant to be believed. How many operations labeled as real history were actually part of a greater land? How many deceptions remain undiscovered, buried in classified archives, still shaping the stories we think we know? Number 42, Operation Sand Flea. in the humid air of 1950s Georgia. A quiet experiment unfolded its presence masked beneath routine military operations in the soft hum of coastal breeze. Operation Sand Flea was one of several covert biological warfare simulations conducted by the United States military. Its purpose was to test the vulnerability of American cities to airborne pathogens without the public ever knowing. Staged in Savannah and surrounding areas, Sand Flea was part of a broader program that included operations like Big Itch and Dropkick. But unlike those, Sand Flea focused on the behavior of aerosolized agents in urban environments. Technicians released benign simulant substances believed at the time to be harmless in two populated areas. Then, using specially designed sampling devices, they tracked how these invisible clouds traveled, how they clung to surfaces, and how easily they entered buildings and lungs alike. The operation was shrouded in secrecy. Residents were never informed. There were no warnings, no signs, no consent. Only decades later would declassified documents hint at the scale and ethical ambiguity of what occurred. Officials insisted the materials were non-toxic, chosen for their similarity to real biological agents. Yet, questions linger about the long-term effects on those unknowingly exposed. Today, Operation Sand Flea is rarely mentioned in history books, but in the silent spaces between what was tested and what was told, a question echoes: how many other communities were quietly transformed into living laboratories without ever knowing they were part of the experiment? Number 43. Operation Garden Plot in the shadow of civil unrest and social upheaval. A quiet strategy was drafted, one that blurred the lines between national security and civil liberty. A classified contingency plan developed by the military's Northern Command, first emerging during the turbulence of the 1960s. It was designed to coordinate federal and military response in the event of domestic disturbance, ranging from protests to riots to large-scale urban insurrections. At its core, Garden Plot outlined how the military could assist local law enforcement under extreme circumstances, included surveillance protocols, communications, logistics, deployment strategies, and detention procedures. While its creators claimed it was a necessary safeguard against chaos, its existence raised critical questions. How far could the government go in the name of order? And who decides what constitutes a threat? Throughout the 1970s and beyond, documents linked to Garden Plot showed deep concern about civil rights demonstrations, anti-war protests, and even student movements. It painted a picture of a nation preparing for war not overseas, but within its own borders. Though the plan was reportedly phased out in the early 2000s, replaced by newer doctrines under Homeland Security, its legacy lingers. Some speculate it served as a framework for more recent emergency response structures once still shrouded in secrecy. Was Garden Plot simply a precautionary measure during volatile times? Or was it the foundation of a silent mechanism waiting in the wings to be activated when dissent crosses an unseen line? Number 44. Operation Noble Eagle in the days following September 11, 2001. As smoke still lingered over lower Manhattan and uncertainty gripped the nation, a new operation was set quietly into motion. Operation Noble Eagle. It was not a war fought overseas, but a defensive stance taken within the borders of the United States. Launched by the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, Operation Noble Eagle was the military's immediate response to the attacks, tasked with protecting U.S. airspace from further threats. For the first time in modern history, fighter jets patrolled American skies, not as a drill, but as a daily necessity. The operation involved around-the-clock mobilization of combat air patrols, radar surveillance, and the rapid integration of civilian air traffic control with military systems. Air National Guard units stood at alert across the country, poised to intercept any aircraft that veered from its flight path. What had once been unthinkable, shooting down a commercial airliner, was now a part of the standard operating procedure. But beneath its clear mandate, Noble Eagle opened new questions. How long could a nation sustain such vigilance? How would the balance between security and personal freedom shift? And who watched the watchers? 2 decades later, Noble Eagle remains technically active, its presence quieter, but its infrastructure intact. As geopolitical tensions evolve and domestic threats grow more complex, one wonders, is Operation Noble Eagle still a shield, or has it become something more? Number 45, Project 4.1. In the summer of 1954, a cloud of radioactive dust swept silently across the Marshall Islands. Fallout from a hydrogen bomb test known as Castle Bravo. But what followed in its wake remains one of the most troubling and mysterious chapters in American medical history. Officially described as a study of the biomedical effects of radioactive fallout, Project 4.1 was launched by the U.S. government to monitor and analyze the impact of radiation exposure on the islanders. The target subjects were the residents of Rongelap and Utrecht Atollsmen, women and children who had no warning of the radioactive storm that would descend upon them. Initially, the project was framed as a humanitarian effort. Medical teams arrived swiftly, administering aid and conducting tests. But declassified documents later revealed a different motive. Some researchers suggest the islanders were not just patients, they were test subjects. The government had allegedly prepared for such an event before the Bravo test even occurred, raising ethical questions that have never been fully answered. The exposed populations suffered from a range of symptoms: hair loss, burns, thyroid disorders, and long-term cancer risks. Meanwhile, data from their bodies was meticulously recorded, charting radiation levels, blood changes, and reproductive health. Decades later, survivors still seek recognition and justice. And as new documents continue to surface, a question lingers in the irradiated silence of the Pacific. Was Project 4.1 a response to tragedy, or a plan already set in motion? Number 46, Operation Looking Glass. In the sky above the continental United States, a plane once circled endlessly day and night, year after year, quietly holding the keys to global annihilation. This was Operation Looking Glass, a Cold War-era command and control mission so secretive few outside military circles ever knew it existed. Initiated in 1961, Operation Looking Glass ensured that even if ground-based command centers were destroyed in a nuclear attack, the U.S. could still retaliate. Airborne command posts, housed in modified EC-135 aircraft, remained in constant flight, crewed with generals, communication officers, and nuclear launch protocols. The call sign Looking Glass referenced its ability to mirror the Pentagon's nuclear command structure: loft, detached, and immune to first strikes. Every mission was carefully choreographed. One plane would land as another took off, creating an unbroken chain of airborne readiness. Communications systems on board could link to nuclear submarines, missile silos, and global outposts. In the event of Armageddon, the fate of the world could have been decided from a high-altitude desk. The operation officially ended its round-the-clock flights in 1990, but versions of the program still exist today, cloaked in modernization and classified updates. What remains uncertain is how often they've been quietly reactivated in moments of geopolitical crisis. Above our heads, the skies may appear empty, but some believe the ghost of Looking Glass still watches from above, waiting for the signal no one hopes will ever come. Number 47, Operation Able Archer 83. In November 1983, the world stood on the edge of a catastrophe it didn't even realize was unfolding. Operation Able Archer 83 was a NATO military exercise designed to simulate the escalation of conflict, from conventional warfare to nuclear release. Held across Western Europe, it was, on the surface, routine. But this time, the scenario was different, more realistic, more detailed, and, crucially, more secretive than any prior drill. It was this realism that rattled the Soviet Union. From Moscow's perspective, the exercise didn't look like a simulation, it looked like cover for a real first strike. Soviet intelligence watched as NATO forces moved command units. Cryptic communications surged, and U.S. officials participated at unusually high levels. Soviet military responded in kind, placing nuclear forces in East Germany and Poland on high alert. For several days, the margin between war game and actual war grew perilously thin. Only later, through declassified files and insider testimony, did the scale of miscalculation become clear. U.S. officials had no idea how close they'd come to triggering a Soviet nuclear launch. Able Archer 83 ended without a missile fired. Number 48. Operation Red Hat in the summer of 1971. Quiet operation unfolded in the Pacific, its details largely hidden from public view, its implications steeped in chemical secrecy. Operation Red Hat was the U.S. military's code name for the transfer of thousands of tons of chemical weapons from Okinawa to Johnston Atoll, a remote island over 700 miles from Hawaii. These weren't ordinary munitions. They included sarin, VX gas, and blistering agents like mustard gas, all remnants of America's chemical arsenal from the Cold War era. The move came after growing local and international pressure, especially following accidental leaks and protests on Okinawa, where the weapons had been stored in deteriorating bunkers dangerously close to civilian populations. The operation was massive. Hundreds of specialized containers, military convoys, and naval ships worked in coordinated silence under high security protocols. Yet, the real story wasn't just about logistics, it was about fear. Fear of exposure, of diplomatic fallout, and of what might happen if even one canister failed in transit. Once the weapons reached Johnston Atoll, they were locked away, out of sight, but not out of history. Decades later, the island became one of the most contaminated sites in the Pacific. Its soil and air still marked by traces of what was stored and later incinerated there. Operation Red Hat faded from headlines, but the legacy of those sealed barrels and silent shipments continues to raise an unsettling question. How many forgotten islands still carry the weight of chemical secrets buried beneath the sand? Number 49. Operation Red Wing. In the spring of 1956, deep in the Pacific Ocean, a series of silent detonations lit the sky over the Marshall Islands. One part of an operation cloaked in calculation, campiation, and consequence. This was Operation Red Wing, a United States nuclear testing program conducted at Bikini and Inutak atolls. It spanned 17 detonations, each designed not just to test the mechanics of warheads, but to explore the limits of thermonuclear design. Air-dropped thermonuclear bomb so massive it could be seen from hundreds of miles away. These weren't just tests, okay? The scientific data gathered was immense. Shockwave behavior, radioactive fallout, weapon yield, and delivery accuracy. But alongside the data came uncertainty. Indigenous populations had been relocated. Many never returned. Naval personnel stationed nearby were exposed to radiation levels that would only be fully understood years later. Despite the operation's scale, much of its documentation remained tightly controlled. Declassified footage shows explosions of awe-inspiring force, but the long-term human and environmental cost remains a quieter story, one not always written into history books. Operation Red Wing helped usher in the era of the hydrogen bomb. Yet, beneath the glow of its mushroom clouds, one is left to wonder how many futures were altered in the name of strategic deterrence. Number 50. Operation Chrome Dome. At 30,000 feet above Earth, invisible to the average citizen, a fleet of bombers circled the skies, armed, alert, and waiting for a command that would never come. This was Operation Chrome Dome, a Cold War-era program launched by the United States in 1960. Its mission was as stark as it was strategic. Maintain a continuous airborne presence of nuclear-armed B-52 bombers, ready to strike the Soviet Union at a moment's notice. Every hour of every day, bombers roared overhead on pre-planned routes across the Arctic and Atlantic, engines humming with the weight of atomic warheads. The rationale was deterrence, ensuring a second strike capability, even if ground-based silos were destroyed. But with this plan came tremendous risk. In 1961, a B-52 crashed near Goldsboro, North Carolina, accidentally releasing 2 hydrogen bombs, one of which came perilously close to detonating. Then, in 1966, a mid-air collision over Palomar, Spain, scattered radioactive debris across the countryside. Incidents like these were labeled broken arrows, accidents involving nuclear weapons. Despite such close calls, the operation continued until 1968, when another crash in Greenland forced the Pentagon to quietly end the program. Officially, Chrome Dome faded into history. Unofficially, its legacy of near catastrophes and unresolved questions lingers. For nearly a decade, nuclear destruction hovered silently in the clouds, an unseen shadow cast over an anxious world. Number 51. Operation Ranch Hand. In the dense green jungles of Vietnam, a different kind of war was being fought, one not with bullets or bombs, but with chemicals designed to erase the very fabric of the landscape. Operation Ranch Hand began in 1962 as part of the United States military strategy during the Vietnam War. Its mission was deceptively simple: to defoliate the dense vegetation that gave cover to Viet Cong forces and to destroy crops that might feed them. Aircraft, often C-123 providers, flew low and slow, releasing trails of herbicides over forests and farmland. Among these chemicals, the most infamous was Agent Orange. This herbicide contained dioxin, one of the most toxic compounds known to science. The effects were not immediate, but they were enduring. Trees wilted into skeletal remains. Rice fields turned barren. Villages beneath the flight paths unknowingly absorbed the chemical into their soil, their water, and their bodies. By 1971, over 20 million gallons of herbicide had been sprayed across South Vietnam. The official objective was tactical advantage. But in the years that followed, a pattern of illness began to emerge. Birth defects, cancers, neurological disorders, both among Vietnamese civilians and U.S. veterans. The operation ended in silence, but its echoes persist. Even today, decades later, children are born in areas once treated by Ranch Hand. Their conditions raising questions that science and policy still struggle to answer. Number 52. Operation Dew, along the southeastern coast of the United States. In the early 1950s, a silent experiment drifted on the wind one few civilians ever knew took place. The particles mimicked the behavior of biological aerosols and were chosen for their visibility under ultraviolet light, an ideal tracer for studying spread patterns. Over the course of 5 known tests, Dew millions of Americans unknowingly became part of an open-air experiment. The particles traveled inland for dozens of miles, detected in towns, fields, and homes. At the time, authorities insisted the compound was harmless, but later, studies raised concerns. Zinc cadmium sulfide contains cadmium, a heavy metal with known toxic properties. Today, questions still linger. Were these tests truly benign? Or were they early signs of a doctrine that placed secrecy above safety? As documents slowly surface, the wind that once carried invisible particles now stirs invisible doubts, remnants of an era when the boundaries of experimentation drifted far beyond the lab. Number 53. Operation Mayday. Beneath the unassuming skies of Minneapolis in 1953, a series of covert experiments quietly unfolded, experiments that few residents knew were happening above their heads. Operation Mayday was part of a broader U.S. Army initiative to study how biological agents might disperse through urban environments. The operation utilized the bacterium Serasims, known for its reddish pigment and ease of detection, as a tracer in simulated biological warfare tests. Throughout May and June, the bacteria were released into the air across the city, carried by balloons and sprayed from rooftops, designed to mimic the spread of a biological attack. The intent was scientific, to map how airborne agents would behave in a dense population center, how wind patterns, building structures, and temperature shifts could influence their distribution. But the people walking beneath those trails, shopping downtown, or opening their windows at night were never informed. Consent. No warnings. At the time, sriracha was believed to be harmless. Later evidence, however, suggested it could cause infections in vulnerable individuals. And while no large-scale illness was officially linked to the May Day test, the ethical questions surrounding them linger. Number 54. Operation Charioteer, beneath the cover of geopolitical tension and technological ambition. Operation Charioteer remains one of the lesser-known chapters in America's military history, a name buried within the labyrinth of classified space programs and Cold War secrecy. Launched during the height of the 1980s, Operation Charioteer was not an overt battlefield campaign, but a covert program nested within the U.S. Air Force's expanding interest in space-based defense systems. Declassified references suggest that it was tied to the Strategic Defense Initiative, an ambitious attempt to develop satellite and laser-based defense mechanisms against nuclear threats. Yet, unlike its public counterparts, Charioteer operated in the shadows. Whispers from declassified documents and insider accounts indicate the program involved testing advanced surveillance technologies, some allegedly capable of observing earthbound activity in real time with unprecedented precision. Others point to early prototypes of spaceborne electromagnetic weapons, tools designed not for destruction, but for disruption, communication, interference, navigation, scrambling, even high-altitude disabling of airborne systems. But what made Operation Charioteer different wasn't just its science, was its secrecy. Few records exist. Team funding trails vanish behind layers of compartmentalized budgets. Even among military circles, the project was mentioned in hushed tones, if at all. Today, the true scope of Operation Charioteer remains uncertain. Was it merely a failed prototype? A prelude to modern space warfare? Something else, entirely an invisible thread connecting past ambitions to the still murky future of orbital conflict. Number 55. Operation Crossroads. In the summer of 1946, on the remote atoll of Bikini in the Marshall Islands, the United States orchestrated a display of nuclear power that would echo through history. Operation Crossroads. This was no ordinary weapons test. It was the first time in history that nuclear detonations were conducted for purposes other than war. 2 atomic bombs codenamed Able and Baker were dropped in carefully staged conditions, including battleships and submarines positioned as silent witnesses. Thousands of animals were placed aboard, wired with instruments to measure the bomb's effects on living tissue. Able was an aerial drop. Baker was something entirely new, and detonation 90 feet underwater. The result was staggering. The Baker explosion threw a column of radioactive seawater 6,000 feet into the air, obliterating nearby ships and saturating the lagoon with deadly fallout. Unlike earlier tests, the contamination clung stubbornly to surfaces. Crews attempting to inspect the target ships found them dangerously irradiated. Cleanup efforts failed. Eventually, many of the vessels were scuttled into the depths of the Pacific. Officially, Operation Crossroads was a scientific effort to understand nuclear effects on naval fleets. But some observers saw Moran act of geopolitical theater, a warning to adversaries, and perhaps a test of how far humanity could bend nature before nature pushed back. And as the sun set on the quiet waters of Bikini Atoll, what remained was not just wreckage but a question that still lingers. How much of that radioactive legacy still pulses beneath the waves? Number 56. Operation Upshot, Knothole, in the spring of 1953. The Nevada desert became the stage for a series of nuclear detonations known as Operation Upshot. Knothole, an experiment that would push the boundaries of atomic warfare and human resilience. 11 nuclear tests were carried out at the Nevada test site, each varying in design, yield, and delivery method. While some devices were dropped from planes, others were detonated atop towers. But perhaps the most unnerving detail was the presence of human observers, soldiers, placed within mere miles of ground zero. Trenches were dug, cameras positioned, military units instructed to watch as atomic fire reshaped the landscape before their eyes. Officials claimed these tests were necessary to understand tactical nuclear warfare. Structures were built to mimic civilian homes, mannequins dressed in 1950s fashion placed inside, and livestock exposed to gauge biological impact. After each detonation, data was meticulously gathered in shock waves, radiation, and human behavior under extreme conditions. Yet decades later, questions still linger. How much of what was observed was scientific exploration, and how much was a rehearsal for something unspoken? The winds scattered more than dust across the desert. That year they carried with them a legacy of uncertainty that still clings to the silent valleys of Nevada. Number 57. Operation Wigwam, far beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. In the spring of 1955, the United States conducted an experiment unlike any before it, one that would test the destructive reach of nuclear weapons in the deep sea, roughly 500 miles southwest of San Diego. A single nuclear device was lowered by cable nearly 2,000 feet into the ocean. Surrounding it, a fleet of ships stood at varying distance, some manned, some unmanned, joined by hundreds of test dummies and hundreds more laboratory rats, goats, and pigs secured in sealed compartments. On May 14th, at precisely 1 p.m., the device was detonated. A towering plume of water erupted into the air, accompanied by a low, distant rumble that echoed for miles. Shockwaves rippled outward beneath the surface, reaching both man and machine. The radiation was quickly absorbed into the sea, but the real consequences were only beginning to unfold. The data gathered was extensive pressure readings, structural damage assessments, biological effects. Yet much of what followed remained quietly classified. Few today recall that a nuclear test of such magnitude occurred so far offshore, in the quiet deserts of Nevada. Between April and June of 1952, a series of controlled detonations rumbled beneath the sky, collectively known as Operation Tumbler. Number 58. Operation Tumbler Snapper in the quiet deserts of Nevada. Between April and June of 1952, a series of controlled detonations rumbled beneath the sky, collectively known as Operation Tumbler Snapper. At first glance, it was just another set of nuclear tests, but behind the chain of explosions was a deeper motive, one rooted in uncertainty, rivalry, and control. Over 7,000 troops participated in what was called Desert Rock 4, training to march into Ground Zero mere moments after the blast, testing both their endurance and the military's readiness for nuclear warfare. Scientists, too, were watching closely. Data collected from Tumbler Snapper-shaped future weapons design, particularly regarding the unanticipated power of shockwaves in urban environments. Meanwhile, observers in the Soviet Union were taking notes of their own. Locked in an arms race, now powered by radiation and silence. Though the craters have long since settled into sand, and the mushroom clouds have faded into history, the implications of Tumbler Snapper remain. Because sometimes, the greatest shockwaves are the ones that travel unseen through policy, perception, and time. Number 59. Operation Castle in the spring of 1954. A chain of detonations lit up the Pacific sky brighter and more destructive than anything the world had ever seen. This was Operation Castle, a series of high-yield thermonuclear tests conducted by the United States at Bikini and Inutak atolls in the Marshall Islands. But what began as a scientific advancement soon blurred into geopolitical tremor. The operation's goal was clear: to test dry-fuel hydrogen bombs, more powerful, more compact, and more deployable than their cryogenic predecessors. The first test, Castle Bravo, changed everything. Detonated on March 1st. It yielded 15 megatons, far beyond the predicted 5. The miscalculation unleashed not only a devastating shockwave, but an invisible hazard. Radioactive fallout that spread over 7,000 square miles of ocean, contaminating nearby islands and a Japanese fishing vessel, Daigo Fukuri Maru, or Lucky Dragon No. 5. In the hours that followed, clouds of fine ash, actually pulverized coral laced with radioactive isotopes, rained down. Islanders suffered radiation burns. The fishermen grew ill. Diplomats grew silent. 6 tests followed, including shots like Romeo, Yankee, and Nectar. Each was an experiment in destructive design, each pushing the limits of megaton engineering. But beyond the physics, Operation Castle marked a turning point. Nuclear power had evolved beyond imagination, and its consequences, once hypothetical, were now visible, painful, and enduring. Today, those atolls remain marked by silence. Number 60. Operation Dominic II, in the shadow of the Cold War's most volatile chapter. A series of nuclear tests unfolded with the name few recall: Operation Dominic II. It was 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis had barely cooled. Yet, the United States launched an unprecedented wave of atomic experiments, not beneath the sea, not in the deserts, but in the very skies above Nevada. Operation Dominic II was the atmospheric component of a broader testing campaign following its oceanic predecessor, Operation Dominic I. But unlike the tropical detonations in the Pacific, these took place within the continental United States, executed as part of Joint Task Force's efforts to assess military survivability and nuclear readiness under realistic battlefield conditions. The tests, 31 in total, used tower shots and airbursts at the Nevada test site. Soldiers, tanks, bunkers, and equipment were placed in concentric rings around the blast zones to simulate war scenarios. Cameras rolled. Sensors blinked. Observers stood behind protective glass, but questions lingered. How much radiation seeped into the surrounding lands? How many civilians downwind would suffer unknowingly for decades to come? Dominic II was one of the last large-scale atmospheric test operations before the limited test ban treaty took effect in 1963. It marked both a culmination of unrestrained experimentation and a quiet reckoning with its toll in human lives, ecosystems, and the very air above. Today, the silence of the Nevada desert carries more than echoes. It carries a history buried in fallout, and the unanswered question of how much was truly learned and how much was quietly forgotten. When with this operation, we reach the final entry in this series, a series built on forgotten tests and buried data. But this isn't the end of the mysteries. If you want us to explore any one of these operations deeper, continue uncovering experiments the world was never meant to see, let us know in the comments. A new mind-boggling series is coming. Be ready.